The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested. On the other side, it was the entrance to what many called the Dark Land. To Dexine, who saw the sun wander across the sky every day, this name had always sounded a bit stupid. Until the day she'd met her first suitor, that is. As it turned out, suitors often said things that had nothing to do with what was actually there, and held on to their figures of speech even after being proven wrong. Strange folk, the people from the other side of the wall, but quite agreeable if one could get used to them, and quite open-handed if one was a guide. The group that Maxim was leading out of the Shadow Gate today was large. More than a dozen people, clad in tight-fitting suits of soft rubber, their heads enclosed in rebreather helmets with reflective visors. It could be quite difficult to tell them apart sometimes, especially if they were all wearing the same color. But this group seemed to be wildly varied. Though two of them wore suits the color of cantaloupes, one was much taller than the other. Three small, six-wheeled vehicles followed the group like packing mules, carrying their equipment. "Look, that one, the one in the blue, that's Worthington," Bales explained. "My grandpapa worked with them. One of his first tours they met, and Worthington has only ever come here if grandpapa was the guide, or papa later, and me now." "If he worked with your grandpapa, how old is this Worthington?" Bales shrugged. "Don't know, don't need to know. The point is, you need to behave. No shenanigans." "I never do shenanigans," Dexine objected. "Well, it's what my papa used to say whenever we went with Worthington, so it has to be important." "Mr. Bales, it's a pleasure, as always. I've been away from here for too long." Worthington said words in a strange manner, as suitors often did, but his speech seemed especially important and laden with meaning somehow. "Pleasure is all mine, Mr. Worthington," Bales repeated, adhering to suitor etiquette. He was not the owner of all pleasure in existence, and Dexine doubted pleasure was even a thing that one could own. "This here is my friend, Dexine. She knows the place you want to go better than I do, so I'm having her tag along." "Excellent. I've always placed great importance on the appropriate expertise," Worthington explained. Bales nodded, and it was clear to Dexine that he hadn't understood a word of what his patron had just said. She did, though. "The appropriate expertise is in my property, Mr. Worthington," she said. For some reason, the man in the blue suit started laughing. "I have no doubt about it." After a short chat with Maxim, who had been paid with a high-capacity water purifier, they learned that it was the first trip to this side of the wall for many of the suitors. Dexine wasn't sure if the Vipertail slopes were the best place for a first-timer, but then it seemed that suitors were completely indestructible, and the sting tongues were hibernating anyway. After that, it was straight off into the wild. It soon became clear that Worthington was experienced with the terrain. Unlike the first-timers, he had no problem navigating the bog without stepping into sinkholes, and didn't recoil from every stink bat and bladderfly. Dexine paid special attention to the women among the suitors, who were the most prone to jumping at anything they were scared of. She neglected to tell them that stink bats and bladderflies were the friendliest of creatures around, to avoid a panic. Ominous shadows stalked around the periphery of the group, and Dexine knew they would claw at anyone who got separated from it. Thus, keeping them all together was the most important thing. It took 2 days to get to the Vipertail slopes. The suitors, as they did, needed many hours of sleep every night, and they had to lie down for it. They sure were a peculiar folk. Meanwhile, Dexine and Bales slept while walking the perimeter every night. When they finally arrived in the dry, grass-covered Vipertail slopes, many of the suitors seemed much more at ease, even though it should have been the other way around. Razorweed and sky sharks were much more dangerous than anything out in the bog. That night, Worthington sat Dexine down for a chat. "I'm afraid I've not been entirely open with you, Miss Dexine." He sounded more apologetic than afraid. "You've been left under the impression that we wanted a tour of the Vipertail slopes, but that is not true. We actually want you to safely lead us to a specific location." Dexine clenched her jaw. There was only one location in the slopes that the suitors had a name for. "I believe you call it the Orange Tower?" Worthington asked. "Nobody can go to Orange Tower. It's where the sky sharks come from." She shivered at the thought of whirring metal blades inside a maw descending from the sky. "I can assure you that the sky sharks, as you call them, will not be a problem." He produced 2 hand-sized discs from his back pocket. "Take one of these and give the other to Mr. Bales. They will identify you as friendlies to the sky sharks. We have them in our suits." Dexine kept her hands away from the tech. "Can't take rewards before doing the job," she noted. Worthington chuckled. "Look at them as a gift. A woman in your line of work will probably find them very useful." Now that was an accurate statement, if they worked. "Why do you want to go to Orange Tower?" "I'm afraid you wouldn't understand even if I told you. It was never planned for anyone to go there, but alas, circumstances have changed." The suitors sighed and left it at that cryptic statement. Despite their new tech, Dexine and Bales were still terrified of their approach to the Orange Tower. A route was easy enough to find, far away from any holes in the ground, where no hands would break through the dirt and drag people down. Dexine knew how to avoid them even around here, in Skyshark territory. With a tech rope as thin as a pinky finger, she was able to let the whole group of suitors down into the basin where the Orange Tower stood. A huge cylinder, perfectly smooth and devoid of windows, sky sharks going in and out of an invisible hole at the top. It was terrifying. When Worthington stepped before it and made a series of hand gestures, the wall of the Orange Tower simply split like a doorway and allowed everyone inside. Dexine had no intention of following. Bad enough that she had to go to the nest of the sky sharks, she certainly wouldn't go inside of it. But Worthington insisted that it was much safer, and seeing as the suitors were all eager to get in, Dexine and Bales followed. It turned out that the Orange Tower was exactly that, a tower. It had rooms in it, with seats, benches, tables, shelves, and blinking lights on the walls. For first-timers, the suitors seemed awfully familiar with the Orange Tower, immediately getting to work with whatever suitor things they did. Once she'd guided a group of suitors who literally just filled a few bottles with water from several ponds and bogs, then returned home and rewarded her with a packet of neurostimulants. In here, things didn't make much more sense. Some of the suitors were ripping out panels of blinking light from the walls and replacing them with new ones. Others were pressing buttons on a vast array of consoles, and even others were assembling something she'd always heard of, but never actually seen in action: firearms. At some point, Dexine and Bales were simply told to go upstairs, sit down, and stop standing around. Dexine was happy to comply. The upstairs was much simpler than the rooms with the blinking lights, and she hadn't even been to the downstairs. Not allowed, they told her. Instead, she sat on a soft bench and looked at the sky sharks float around the tower through a huge window that could not be seen from the outside. It was fascinating. She was suddenly no longer scared of them, just like that, and they even seemed strangely beautiful to her. That night, when all the suitors were sleeping, Dexine was awake. They expected her to sleep like they did, but she didn't. Driven by something she could not quite explain, Dexine silently slipped off her sleeping bench and snuck downstairs, where a single suitor was sitting at a desk, his head resting between his hands, struggling to stay awake. Without making a sound, her feet carried her to the basement ladder. She knew she should be terrified, and on some level she was, but Dexine was an explorer, and telling her that there were places she wasn't supposed to go had always prompted her to go there. There was nobody down here either, only a big, round room with a cage in the middle. A wide array of guns and other equipment was lying around on the floor, ready to be used the following day. One side of the cage seemed to be missing, so, just to test it out, Dexine stepped inside. She immediately regretted her decision. With a loud clacking noise, the cage fell down into the darkness, turning on some lights of its own. Then it began its slow descent. Over the following moments, Dexine felt herself get lighter and lighter, and had trouble telling where up and down was. Eventually, what had once been the ceiling became the ground, and the whole cage turned upside down. It was the strangest thing she'd ever experienced, but she had no fear. After a few more moments, the cage appeared in a room similar to the one inside the Orange Tower, only this one was devoid of weapons. When she went upstairs, Dexine found that it, too, was identical. On the level above that, she saw something she could not comprehend. Strange enough that the sky sharks didn't attack suitors, and that the floor had turned to ceiling. But this had Dexine frozen in place, unable to understand what was happening on the other side of the huge window. It was a wilderness, similar to the one that was her home, but this one was different. Instead of in a basin, the Orange Tower was on a hill, overlooking shallow waters of blue so intense she had never imagined it could actually be real. It was so clear that she could see tiny fish swim around inside it, and birds stalk through the mud. The water stretched to the horizon, where Dexine could see several plumes of smoke rise into the heavens. And the heavens, the firmament, it was even stranger than all the other things. Whereas it had been the dead of night just moments before, on the other side, up here it was the middle of the day. "This is my mistake," said the familiar voice of Worthington behind her. "I apologize, Miss Dexine. You were never intended to see this." He had a gun in his hand. If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.